Last year we gave something, this is last financial year, we gave something around, I think it was 56% of our total amount went to the environment. It's going to be much higher than that this year. So it's huge.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's conversation is with Cheryl Spain. Cheryl is the executive director of the Gift Trust. I've been a client of the Gift Trust for several years. It's one of my favorite organizations in the New Zealand nonprofit community. The Gift Trust is a donor advised fund, and donor advised funds can make it much easier for donors to give to different nonprofits, as well as reducing the barriers on nonprofits for receiving money. We get into that and more with Cheryl and how the Gift Trust operates in this way. We also talk about the broader trends that Cheryl has seen in philanthropy, what she's seen around New Zealand relative to the rest of the world. We discuss the unfortunate fact that environmental initiatives still receive a very paltry sum of total philanthropic dollars in the space. We go into some of the innovations that are really, I believe, under-discussed about the Gift Trust, one of which is the Gift Collective, a partnership with Open Collective to make it much more streamlined for smaller or more temporary projects to receive tax-deductible funding. And we also get into an exciting new initiative that Cheryl has birthed, a partnership with Give to Asia around expanding the philanthropic support and community in New Zealand around the Asia-Pacific region. I really appreciate Cheryl's steady leadership in this space. We recorded this conversation in March 2023 at Mangaroa, New Zealand. I hope you enjoy it. Cheryl Spain. Today we are here with Cheryl Spain, the Executive Director of the Gift Trust. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And so what is the Gift Trust?
The Gift Trust is, I guess the international term is a donor advised fund, although we operate a little bit differently in New Zealand. So we're a donor advised fund in New Zealand designed for philanthropic donors who want to gift to a wide range of causes, charitable causes. And we operate a fund on behalf of our donors. We follow our donors' wishes and distribute funds according to their wishes and do all the, I like to say sometimes, do all the boring bits for them so they can get the joy out of their giving. But actually we do a lot of bespoke research, and I think of us as also like an introducer, a bit of a conduit between the causes on the one hand and the funders on the other, and introducing, translating sometimes and helping people to see what's out there and helping donors to refine their strategy. So it's a combination of doing the gifting on their behalf, but also the research and support when they need it. Some donors need more and some need less. So that's the space that we fit in.
Nice. And how did you come into this work?
I've always worked in the charity sector. So ever since I left university, I had a passion for wanting to do good with my work in some way, and I was a little bit unclear as a 20-something-year-old what that might look like in the beginning, but I actually worked right from the very beginning. My first job post-university was with a New Zealand conservation group called the Forest and Bird Society, so I had quite a passion for wanting to do something in the environmental space, and I sort of ended up, as a lot of people do in that world, falling into fundraising. Sometimes that's kind of where that lands. I suppose I was a good, I enjoyed the communication. I enjoyed talking about a cause to an audience, and I started off in sort of membership services for those types of groups and ended up moving overseas and working for 20 years in the UK, nearly 20 years in the UK, for a range of organisations in the charity sector. And I did a range of roles from fundraising to more project development, I would say. So helping groups to get projects off the ground, which might include a bit of funding, but also actually the practicalities of how it worked, staffing, all of those things. And then when I moved back to New Zealand, I was looking for a role that was a bit different. I'd moved out of fundraising for some time. I'd been doing project management, project setup, and I was interested in philanthropy because I'd been working with, in the UK, quite a lot of, in the major donor space, we would say, so with quite a lot of donors and sort of doing that translation piece almost. And it was one of those fortuitous circumstances where the role came up at the Gift Trust, seemed to match my skills quite well. It was a new, still fairly new and pretty tiny organisation when I joined 6 years ago. So my role really at that time was to grow it, talk about what the Gift Trust was, give it a bit more presence, branding, build a team. So I've built a team now so that there's more of us. When I first started, it was just me. So it was kind of a do a bit of everything sort of role. And now we've got a bit of presence, we've got a bit of scale, we've grown to a size now in terms of the numbers of donors we represent as well as the funds that we have under management, which means we can do more interesting things and more partnerships. So yeah, that's how I came into it. It's a great role. I love it. It's pretty varied.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that process and witnessing the growth, and from just you to now a full-fledged organization with a lot of presence and established funds under management and a lot of different clients and nonprofits who know the work. And it's just such an important part of the charity infrastructure of New Zealand to have this non-for-profit donor-advised fund that can be this bridge and gateway and wayfinder in the ecosystem here. And so for those who aren't as familiar with donor-advised funds, maybe we can just walk through what a donor experience might look like. So they, take a pool of money and give it to the Gift Trust, but they still have control over where it goes.
That's right. I like to think of it, and I think you talk about it like this too. It's a bit like having a charitable bank account is how I sort of describe that process. So a donor might have been gifting for some time to good causes. They're perhaps in a comfortable position in their lives. They want to do more with the money they've got. Oftentimes people come to us when they've hit that point where they've been gifting for some time, but they don't feel that they're really making a huge difference, or they're not sure. They want to be more strategic. So what happens is they open a fund with us. Legally, it is a donation to the Gift Trust at that time, and that's an important thing because it means for tax effectiveness they can get their tax effective receipt at that point when they gift into the Gift Trust. We open an earmarked fund on their behalf. They can name it whatever they like. So they could name it after their family, they could name it after their company, or whatever they like to do. And then we earmark those funds for charitable purpose, but it is totally within the donor's control where, to whom, and how often they gift those funds out. So although it's legally managed and controlled by the Gift Trust because we are a non-for-profit charitable entity, they do retain advisory powers, we call it. So that means we have to follow their wishes of when they'd like to donate those funds out, what sort of causes they'd like to donate to. And as long as it's legally charitable under New Zealand charitable law, we can do it. So that's how it works. And then it's a totally flexible tool. So it is a bit like having a bank account for your giving because people can give into it as often as they want. Some people fund, we call it a gift account. Some people fund their gift account with a big lump sum. They might have a sale of a company or they sell a house. We've recently had a donor who inherited their parents' house and didn't want those funds and just put all of the sale proceeds into a gift account. Some people fund it over a period of time, so others might grow their fund with regular gifts in. And then again, donations out, very similar, flexible approach. So some people have quite a planned strategic approach where they're gifting sort of set amounts every year. Others follow their passions and enthusiasms a bit more, and probably the majority like us to help them with some form of a strategy so that they're at least being more mindful and thoughtful about their gifting. So yeah, that is how it operates. But it's a very flexible tool that allows people to do gifting in an easier, more effective way and retain control, but not have the burden. It's kind of having the control, but without the burden and the stress of running a new entity, which other people, particularly in a New Zealand context, it's been quite common for people to set up their own charitable foundation, even when they don't have a large amount of funds. And that can get really burdensome. They're paying for accountants and lawyers to run it for them. And oftentimes, especially when a generation has moved on within a family, it becomes really burdensome. The next generation have inherited this thing from a previous generation. They don't quite know what the original goal was. Times have moved on. It sort of gets lost. So something like the Gift Trust actually helps in those scenarios too, because it means we can follow the wishes of the original donors. And we have all that sort of down in writing too. And we have a succession plan so that we know what to do if the original person or generation who set it up has passed on.
Yeah, I really emphasize that point, and it seems the global trend of how much adoption of donor-advised funds amidst the fastest-growing segment of philanthropy proves it out that the administrative burden of using a donor-advised fund is so dramatically less than trying to create your own foundation and your own nonprofit charitable entities to administer all of this. So if you're just going to focus in on grant making, or as we like to call it, gift making, then it really is a logical and attractive approach to use a donor advised fund where you still have autonomy and the advisory powers to say, we would like to donate to this school or to this, education initiative or this environmental project. But that's when I make a gift through Gift Trust, I put like 3 or 4 form fields in your website and then I'm done.
Yeah.
Right. You are all doing the diligence to make sure it's a registered nonprofit, contacting, doing all the banking transfers, reporting all of the compliance, to charitable services, to the Inland Revenue Department. Like, I don't have to do any of that. And yet the tax effect to me of having funded my gift account and receiving that tax deductibility is exactly the same. And I pay just a tiny percentage that you take from total funds under management, but it's very modest and reasonable and lower than most international donor advised funds as well.
Yeah, we like to keep it very light touch. Obviously, we're all about effectiveness and reducing the burden both on the donor and also on the charitable entity. So that's really important as well for us. So that's why we try and keep everything light touch. Like I said, we try and take all those boring bits away, and we try and do the same on the charity side. So we do a lot of due diligence. Obviously, we have to do that legally on all the gifts that we make. But again, unlike some grant-making foundations where they might have open grants rounds where they're asking charities to fill in a number of forms and all sorts of long, unwieldy application forms, we don't ask for any of that. So we're really we're a proactive funder. We're approaching the charities that the donors want to gift to. We're doing as much work up front as we possibly can by using publicly available sources of information, so that by the time we approach the charity, quite often all that we are saying is, hi, this is us. We're about to make a large gift to you of X amount of dollars. We've already got everything we need. We just need to verify your bank account information. And most of the time the charities fall over themselves because they're like, wow, this is so easy. We've never had a grant like this before.
Right. So
we try and make it burden-free on both sides wherever we can. The slight caveat is sometimes when we gift internationally, because I should have said we can also and do also gift internationally, we do need to do a little bit more due diligence, obviously, when it's an international organisation.
Right.
But still try and keep it as light touch as we can.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an important point of what is the burden that we place on the nonprofits being supported by funders, foundations, philanthropy. I think it's easy to forget that these organizations are typically under a huge amount of pressure and constraints and don't have a lot of extra capacities to, need to write lots of reports for every different type of funder and grant application. And, they're needing to spend a lot of time fundraising that is unsuccessful because, your typical grant applications might only get, 2%, 5%, 10% success rates. And we want them to be able to do the work in the communities that they serve, right? So how do we, as a philanthropic community, ease those administrative burdens and to really, it's in all of our collective interest to just try to make the process simple. And I see the Gift Trust, because you sit across both a network of funders and donees, able to kind of streamline and operationalize and make a lot of this easier. But importantly, that you have that ethic, that you have that emphasis for making sure that the burden is reduced.
And there's a lot of talk about this in the philanthropic community in general, really, is how do we reduce that burden and make sure that the organisations that we're all supporting are spending their time doing the work that we're supporting them for, right? Not writing these things and these reports which no one ever reads half the time and duplicating information. That's my particular bugbear, is a lot of these organisations are having to report to this funder on this particular aspect of the project, and then they're reporting to that funder on that aspect, and they're kind of having to tweak their information. And I've been on the other side of it, so I know exactly how that works. You're having to write one application and you've kind of got to copy and paste bits from here and there and track your budget, so you've spent X amount of those people's dollars on this part of the work, and you've got to report back on that, and you've spent this part on this. So there's a move in the philanthropic sector for more trust-based philanthropy, but with a lens of, obviously, that doesn't mean we're just handing over cash and not tracking it. We're still doing the work, but I think the burden is more on the funders to do the work sometimes. And also that also means that the nonprofits that get funded are not just the ones who can write well, right? Who can write a good application, because that's not a great way to choose who to support. Just because they happen to have employed somebody who's maybe good at writing grant applications doesn't mean they're the best at doing that piece of work. So it kind of evens out the playing field a bit and has a bit more equity over it. So I think that's something that's important. I think we need to talk more in philanthropy about that. There's all sorts of different things out there that are happening that can help. There's kind of a lot of funders who are working together to share information. There's kind of shared databases now where we can all share information and do due diligence without having to ask all of these entities for the same information. I don't think there's a magic bullet yet that we've kind of come across, but I think it's always thinking from that lens of kind of, what am I asking this group for and why am I asking it? And is it just to tick a box or to fulfill my, even from that donor's perspective, my personal preference for having to have that bit of information, or actually is what you need to do, have a conversation with the group and just ask them some questions. And there's a lot of funders who their report back requirements are now come to a dinner and share information with a lot of other nonprofits that we support, or just sit down with me once a year and have a conversation, or go on a visit. There's different ways of doing it without having to burden them to do all of those forms and various things that are burdensome.
Right, because there's the compliance and accountability requirements, but then there's also the psychological desire to understand, is this having an impact, and what kind of impact, and how does that information transmission need to happen? And I think for me, part of the approach that funders can take can be just adopting to the organization's preference and how they want to do that. Maybe the organization invites the funder to and other funders to a dinner, and then they can do a one-to-many communication. Or maybe the nonprofit is sending out monthly newsletters and like that. And so it's on the funder to if you really want to honor and respect the organization, adopt to their preferred methods of communication as well, is a way to ease their administrative burden. So you talked about trust-based philanthropy and this movement. What are some of the other trends that you're seeing, and what are you seeing specifically within the New Zealand philanthropic context?
There's a lot of conversation in New Zealand around how we can better work as a philanthropic sector together and share information. So the trust-based philanthropy model is part of that, kind of sharing information around nonprofits, but also it's around getting us as a sector to work better and to oblige ourselves to do some of this working together. That oftentimes, when I was a fundraiser, the numbers of times when funders asked you as a nonprofit, how much are you working together with others in your sector, and are you sharing information? But actually, the philanthropic sector is not always great at doing it themselves. So I think sharing information, working together with like-minded funders who have similar causes that they support, being more strategic around what types of giving they are doing, having really clear plans around kind of almost divvying up who is supporting what to make sure that a whole sector is covered, I think is one move that's being talked about and being acted upon here in Aotearoa a lot more. We've also got interesting conversations happening around particular sectors. So pertinent to these conversations that you're having is the environment, and that is a sector, particularly within New Zealand, which has been underfunded and yet, perversely is in such need to be funded. Our stats in New Zealand are not great, so we don't have huge amounts of statistics on how much funding is going, but really anywhere between, say, 3 and 6 or 7% of total philanthropic dollars is one of the figures that gets bandied around how much might go to the environment as a whole. And that's kind of personal philanthropic dollars, so that's individuals and families mostly that we're talking about. So it's tiny, way too tiny. So one of the conversations that's happening, I notice in philanthropy, and a trend that's happening is that people are talking about the environment and climate as something that needs more funding and that needs more focus. So we're part of a climate change funders network, for example, here in New Zealand, and we're also thinking about how that can work broader than just New Zealand too. And there's a variety of things in that sort of sector space as well, not just climate and the environment, but a number of things where people are looking at particular sectors and shining a spotlight on it from a philanthropic point of view. Child poverty is another one here in New Zealand that's been endemic, and it's been persistent, and it's been generation after generation, and philanthropic dollars haven't sort of moved the dial. And so people are looking at things like that from a point of view of not just being that traditional ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and throwing money at those really important things that need it, like, say, food boxes and things, but actually looking at intervention at the beginning and systems change, kind of funding systems change and movements, which might address some of those long-term persistent issues, but get to the root of problems, not just kind of when the problem becomes more of a burden and acting in that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff way.
Do you have any observations about how New Zealand's philanthropic sector compares to the rest of the world?
It's always hard to find statistics on these things, and we don't measure it particularly well here. But the one that I do know is that there is a World Giving Index, I think it's called, and they sort of rank countries based on how much gifting comes from individuals, companies, and there's various other factors in the report, usually around volunteerism as well. So it includes philanthropy, but also how many people get engaged in different causes. And I know on those reports from last year, New Zealand was ranked 3rd in the world. It's obviously by population per capita. So that means that we were the 3rd most generous. I hope I'm getting this right, that America was the 1st. Mm-hmm. I think it was an unusual 2nd last year, and I'd have to double check. It was possibly somewhere in Asia. I'd have to double check. And then New Zealand was 3rd. But we've always consistently ranked sort of 3rd or 4th in the world. So we're a pretty generous nation. I think what's interesting in those studies often is that we have a really high proportion of sort of the every person who gives. So people who are not on high incomes, but give a relatively large proportion of their income as donations. So that is quite high for New Zealanders compared to some other countries. And obviously high-level giving from people on higher incomes is also high, but I think it's that medium kind of level which is particularly high in New Zealand.
And you had mentioned the 2 to 6% or 3 to 6% going to the environment, and you and I have had many conversations about this, because I think what people on the outside of this sector fail to recognize is that number is of total grant dollars going out on an annual basis. Mm-hmm. So if all of philanthropy was $100 that went out in a year to nonprofits, then we're saying, roughly $3 to $6 goes to the environment. But the reality is that $100 is actually a tiny proportion of all of the money inside of foundations and endowments.
Yeah.
Right? And orders of magnitude, it's probably roughly 5%. So, if the $100 went out, what we're actually talking about is that there's $2,000 in philanthropy. So here we are with, if we had a pot of $2,000 and then we're like, so how much goes to the environment in the world's hottest years on human record, in the midst of converging ecological crises and collapse? How about 3? Right?
Depressing.
Maybe 5. It's like, okay, we have to do something differently here. And if we can move endowment capital from stocks and bonds into more projects and biophysical assets and conservation initiatives and reforestation and natural capital, then we can really start talking about systemic shift. Because if we just focus on the grant making, then we're also taking it away from something in one view of it, right? So it's like, well, we don't want to reduce the amount going to child poverty or to affordable housing or to education. So we can either increase the effectiveness of that $100 we're giving every year, or we can also just reach out and look at the bigger picture of total philanthropic capital inside the endowments and the large investment pools. And that's one of the reasons that I really wanted to chat with you and appreciate so much of the Gift Trust work, because the events you host, the kind of awareness building that you're putting out there, the kinds of introductions that you make, it seems like you're really a leader in this climate philanthropy conversation. And I don't know if you want to share anything about kind of, well, how much of the Gift Trust is actually orienting funds this way?
Well, it's very high for us. So it's not, pleasingly, it's not between 3 and 6% of our philanthropic dollars. And a lot of that is to do with your gifting as well, which you do through the Gift Trust. Last year, we gave something, this is last financial year, we gave something around, I think it was 56% of our total amount went to the environment. It's going to be much higher than that this year. So it's huge. We're attracting, we have an interesting mixture of donors that we attract, and we are attracting more and more who are interested in the environment. I'm also finding it really interesting that we're attracting groups of donors. So something I didn't mention is we do run quite a few gift accounts now, which are groups of like-minded people who operate a bit like a donor circle. And quite a few of those are focused on the environment or climate in particular. And so these might be set up by a group of people, but they also open up their gift account to the public. So we have one, just to give an example, it's called the Climate Change Net Zero Fund, set up by 2 individuals originally, but they've opened it wider, and we now attract way more funds into that gift account from just a broader section of the public who they buy into the ethos of what that fund is going to do, and they put money into it, and then obviously we distribute it out based on the wishes of the original people. But it's interesting that we've attracted kind of groups like that, and then they've opened up it to a wider group. And so, yes, our events, we do try and focus events on this sector of funding. We think it's part of our role, really. It's part of our moral ethos is to shine a light on causes which maybe are not getting so much funding. Personally, for me, I worked in that sector, so I'm interested in it as well, which helps. But also, if we have a group of donors that are interested in that, it behoves us, I think, to talk about that field of interest. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, we've attracted donors, you put on events, you get more donors from that field. So hopefully we're part of the ecosystem that will grow that funding in New Zealand, I hope.
Yeah.
But I'd love to see more of the endowment. Like you say, I think it's about using more than just the grant making, and that is something that we would like to do. A lot of that is happening in the States, which obviously you will know about. It hasn't really happened so much here. I don't think it's a conversation. We're a little bit behind the 8 ball on that in New Zealand. We haven't had those conversations as much here around how to use our endowments and really how to think about those endowments. It's starting to happen, and more philanthropic trusts are talking about things like social loans to nonprofits or impact investment. It's starting to be talked about, but it's kind of much earlier stage, I would say.
Yeah, earlier stage, although in the conversations I'm a part of, which is just one small, niche of this nonprofit industrial complex, it feels early stage everywhere to me,
True.
and still relatively modest as a total proportion of funds. And with certain deep respect to those funders who have been out on and progressing these edges for decades, and there's tremendous work that's been done, of course, in different pockets. So I want to also emphasize the initiative you have around Open Collective, and maybe you can share a bit more about what that is and what the purpose is.
Sure. So Open Collective is actually a company that was started in the US. But is now global. They have operations in a wide variety of countries, including now New Zealand. And we partner with Open Collective. So Open Collective really was set up as a tech platform initially to help groups, and they were set up not just to help charitable groups, I should emphasize. So that includes startup businesses, charitable groups, mutual aid groups, all sorts of community kind of organizations. And what they are is a tech tool which allows any kind of collective of people to co-manage a budget, to seek funding for their particular project, to have it all be completely transparent online around how they're spending that funding. So it's essentially a tech tool which is like an open budget. You can see how much funding is coming in, and you can see exactly what it's being spent on, right down to individual invoices. That group has spent $100 on buying a piece of equipment for that event or what have you. So that's why they were set up. They're really large now across the States and other countries. They came to New Zealand a few years ago, and we are now the partners with Open Collective in New Zealand, and we run a particular initiative on the Open Collective platform, which we call Gift Collective. So you can see what we did with our names there. We took the gift part of the Gift Trust and the collective part of Open Collective. So the Gift Collective basically is a tool that is under the Gift Trust's legal umbrella. So it's our entity, but it's a partnership which we use the Open Collective platform. And what Gift Collective does is it allows small, emerging, usually emerging groups in New Zealand which are charitable, have charitable purpose, to be auspiced under our charitable umbrella. So basically it means a group of volunteers, say, working on a conservation cleanup program. They might have been operating just through one individual person's bank account, probably. That's how these groups sometimes start. They kind of get some momentum, they start going, and then they suddenly think, oh, wait a minute, we can't really keep operating under this person's individual bank account. We can't go and apply for a grant. It's all getting a bit messy. They're looking for a structure. And instead of necessarily setting up as their own registered charitable entity, they might want either a temporary home, or they might not ever be ready to set up as a charitable entity because they're never going to be that big. It's probably not worth their time. So we provide the charitable structure. But the beauty of it is, what I love about it, there's a lot of crossovers with the Gift Trust and what we do, of course, with shining a spotlight on some of these small groups to our funders. But the real beauty of it is the transparency, which I particularly love. So it just means that anyone who's donated to that project, right from an individual donor who gives $10, because they can collect, it's like a crowdfunding platform as well, right through to a large philanthropic funder, which now a lot of them are supporting Gift Collective projects in New Zealand. They can go online and they can see exactly what their group has done with the money. They can also use the platform to send newsletters and updates and things to people. So it's quite a powerful tool. And it's also, I particularly love the fact that it really is a collective. So it's all about giving these groups power, control, and ownership over their narrative and their story and their budget, and kind of opening their project up to the world. And it has that power, I think, to put them in touch with groups that they might not otherwise be in touch with, or funders that they might not other be in touch with. So we see it as a really emerging thing. We're really excited because we've just hit the 1 million New Zealand dollar mark, where $1 million of funding has gone through the Gift Collective now, which is big for small groups, because we're talking mostly fairly small groups that use this. We've got about 60 odd groups now that have signed up through the Gift Collective, real variety of organisations. that use it, from documentary filmmakers who record films around environmental programs through to alternative kind of health or like Māori-based medicine sort of initiatives through to a lead poisoning advocacy group, and everything, all sorts of different groups that use it. We have groups that work with gangs in New Zealand to help young people get out of gang violence, real range of different groups. We're seeing a lot of traction.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, Open Collective is not necessarily a Web3 crypto. It's not from those roots. And yet a lot of the emphasis on openness and transparency is very similar to what we see in the DAO space and the Web3 space emerging. But I'd say Open Collective's really been a leader and early to this kind of digital infrastructure that can create transparency in groups about where funds are flowing and really create more horizontal organizing platforms and just flexible tools to recognize that not every project or initiative is necessarily perpetual. Sometimes it's just kind of temporal in its space, and that we're continually now in this conversation hitting this theme of how do we ease the burdens for the administration of these different activities that belong in the charitable umbrella space. But if it always has to do with creating your own charity trust or 501c3 or foundation or that those things can become barriers to the flow of funds and to the work that needs to be done. And huge respect to the Open Collective team and Alana Irving, who I know is a trustee on the Gift Trust as well, and deeply involved in this. Good work, Alana. So I just want to recap that like a use case, just to really bring it home in case listeners aren't fully yet grasping the power of this model. So if I want to do a beach cleanup this weekend, and I'm like, okay, I just believe in this. Let's go out for beach cleanup. And I get 5 of my friends and we pick up, enormous amounts of trash and we all feel really good. And then the next week we go, well, let's do it again and invite more of our friends. And we post it on social media. And now, oh my gosh, like 50 people are showing up to this beach cleanup. Well, it'd be good to feed everyone some pizzas and thank everyone for volunteering. And it's like, okay, now I don't really want to do all this out of my personal bank account, but do I have to put together a corporate entity or a nonprofit entity? And when are we going to file the charity services and create a whole deed and hire lawyers? And no, I just need to how can we pool some funds together to buy some pizzas together and do this? And oh, by the way, the community foundation here has a mandate around ocean cleanup and environmental projects, and they'll chip in, but only if I can qualify for charitable status.
Yeah.
I don't have charitable status, So this is just such an easy way. I can just sign up for the Gift Collective, create an account there, and now all of a sudden people can all contribute, join, we can share the expense load, and we can qualify for charitable status to get money from the philanthropic community. And then the Gift Trust and associated entities and parties can introduce this to funders and say, hey, you have an account at the Gift Trust, or hey, you're a foundation. Did you see? And the tool just makes all of it easy and visible, and you can see which campaigns are going. And I've witnessed projects coming out of the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, fellows coming in from overseas into New Zealand or already here, use this infrastructure to kind of quickly get started and to incubate projects, quite successfully. So it's kind of the merging of all of these different worlds and crowdfunding, like you said. Do I have that roughly correct?
Perfect use case. Yeah. It's quick, it's easy, but it also has pretty robust checks and balances for the due diligence, which helps with the community foundation example that you mentioned, helps with more traditional funders to give them confidence that, this group is not just a random beach cleanup group that's been set up and we don't really know who they are. It's actually been auspiced by the Gift Trust. We know the checks are all in place. we know it's all online. They're going to be checking to make sure that everything is charitable and legitimate. So yeah, it's a great example, and it does make things easy. Like you said, it ties into this whole conversation we're having about we see our purpose really is helping ease flows of funding, make that burden free if possible. Just clear barriers out of the way, be that kind of admin tool for people to use in whatever flexible way they like. So we've seen some really amazing stories emerge from it, and also not just always small. I did say mostly small projects, but we've even had some quite large projects use it, which might be time-limited projects. It's another interesting use case is if you were setting up a charitable program, but you only saw it lasting as for maybe a year, for a particular reason, perhaps it's just a project you're working on, it's got an end date. Why would you go through all that bother of registering with the Charity Commission, getting lawyers, writing your trust deed? That's going to delay you by a couple of months right at the beginning. So we can onboard people, get them up and running within a couple of days usually once we can check their application. So it's a really nice, neat tool for people to be able to use.
Amazing. And I think it also speaks to the power of the gift trust being a not-for-profit entity, that you were able to make this strategic choice to focus in on a segment that's smaller in terms of total dollars. And so therefore your take and cut in all of this is going to be tighter and leaner in terms of your ability to, so it's not just scaling your business as much as you're responding to the community need and saying, hey, there's a lot of small, amazing grassroots projects and temporary projects that need to have support. And so you're really driving it from that mission. And like the donor advised fund space is globally characterized in many respects by large banks and financial institutions that have a very strong incentive for total assets under management to get the money managed into their fund portfolios. And it's one of the shadows or downsides of the incentive alignment or misalignment that can exist in this space, with all due respect to people who are doing really good work in those organizations. So I think it's to me it's just another example and one of many of why it's so potent that the Gift Trust is here in New Zealand as a non-for-profit.
Yeah, you're right. And we did see it as quite a strategic move, the Gift Collective, and we had to be quite thoughtful of that because in the beginning it was kind of it was just covering costs maybe in the beginning, but we certainly didn't do it as a money-making enterprise. So I think that's really important when you're a non-profit and you're still relatively small, although we're much bigger now, and you're emerging. You need to be quite mindful and thoughtful around actually what is it that we believe, what are our values as an organisation and what do we believe in. And we saw a real gap, our trustees and me and our team, in the New Zealand market for this kind of service. We see ourselves in service not just to our donors but to the New Zealand charitable sector, and we saw a lot of struggles on that side, and it fitted so neatly with everything else we were doing that it was worth us investing the time. Pleasingly, it's now grown to a point where it's more than washing its own face now. It's able to cover all its costs. We're employing a wonderful woman, my colleague Chloe, who runs it. And actually we're in this amazing situation where just a couple of weeks ago we sat down as a group and looked at this pot of money which we've now got from the fees, which we can do something exciting with. So we're just making some decisions now around how we reinvest that in the Gift Collective, what more we want to do, what kind of outreach. It's come to a certain scale now where it's getting a lot of traction, particularly in the philanthropic community. So we find now we get almost as many recommendations for new groups that are joining us from funders as we do from the groups themselves. So, a funder wants to give money to this group, but they can't because they don't have charitable status. And they're like, oh, go and speak to the Gift Trust over here. So it's great to get it to that point.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the other initiatives and what's being cooked up now within the Gift Trust?
One of our latest exciting things, and this is a bit of me saying yes to everything at the moment, is that we are going international. We're not exactly going international. We have a new international partnership, which we're really excited about. So we were approached about 18 months ago, perhaps 2 years ago now, by an entity called Give to Asia, which are fairly big. They started in the States. They've been around for about 20, 30 years, I think. And they were originally designed as getting philanthropic dollars from the US into Asia, hence their name. They now, though, have offices in mainland China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. And they really operate across the whole of Asia. They're all about kind of getting inflows and outflows of philanthropic dollars across the region. But they had acquired some funding to do a really big piece of research. It was actually funded by the Gates Foundation originally. They did a piece of research looking at the whole of the Asia Pacific region, which included New Zealand and Australia. And they were looking at kind of what infrastructure exists across that whole region to allow philanthropic money to flow in and out of different countries to fund good causes. As you can imagine, it's a broad, disparate region, lots of different regulatory frameworks. So we needed somebody like that to do that piece of research to find out what was happening in all those different countries. They identified New Zealand as one of the key players across the region, partly because we have a relatively low burden regulatory infrastructure for getting philanthropic dollars out of the country. So some countries make it really difficult to get money out. Australia, for example, has quite different rules than New Zealand does. For philanthropic dollars to flow out of the country there, they have to support quite a prescribed list of causes, whereas we don't have that problem here. So we're a little bit, it's a little bit easier, but also there is quite a lot of interest. I mean, the New Zealand diaspora, if you can think of it like that, sort of globally is pretty big. New Zealanders have a tendency to travel and live overseas, and so there's quite a number of it's both inflows and outflows. There's a number of Kiwis who are living across the Asia Pacific region who might want to get funding back into New Zealand. Likewise, there's interest from a lot of New Zealanders in supporting projects internationally. So anyway, we were approached by Give to Asia to have a conversation around would we like to join a new network. And what they had identified is a number of countries in the region which would be a good sort of test case for this new network. We've got New Zealand, Australia, mainland China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan, and South Korea on that list. And what they would like to do is have a philanthropic partner, one in each of those countries. And we are the philanthropic partner in New Zealand. And we've now formed this new network. It's very early days. We haven't even given it a name yet. We're calling it the Asia Pacific Cross-Border Giving Network. That's not going to be its name, obviously.
It rolls off the tongue.
Rolls off the tongue. So we've got to brand it and all of that. But we were really excited that we've just hosted all of the partners across the network here in Wellington. And this was the first time that we've hosted the group here now that the group is fully formed. We did have an earlier meeting in Singapore, which I was lucky enough to attend in 2022, but that was just when we were having the early discussions. So the group is now formed. We hosted them here in Wellington. We had people it was very exciting. We had people from Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and the States through Give to Asia. And we basically had our first network meeting where we talked about what will this thing look like. And what we're trying to do is set up an infrastructure, really. I think of it as kind of, we're getting the piping, right? So we're getting the infrastructure set up so that we can allow really clear, simple ways for funders to if we have a donor here in New Zealand who is really interested in supporting a project with young women and girls in Vietnam, getting them into school or something or better education, we will know who to go to find out what projects are happening on the ground. So it's both a kind of knowledge network of people on the ground that will know where to go to find out the information, but also the facility to move funds. So it's not just about the money, it's actually also about the building the knowledge and pooling resources to allow us to have a bigger impact in all of those countries.
I love it. I mean, it just seems so consistent with the journey of Give Trust and this bringing a culture of generosity by really focusing in on what is the pipes and the infrastructure to enable donors to come into platforms and have their own giving bank account, so to speak, to enable nonprofit projects or charitable projects to be able to come in through Gift Collective, even if they don't necessarily have their own charitable trust structures set up, enabling flow of funds, introductions, events, networks, and now you're expanding that same thinking and those same models to how do we have global partnerships and to really ease the flow of funds cross borders into where it's needed at any given time. Are you seeing any themes around the South Pacific Islands being a part of this? Because I know that's really important to New Zealand as well.
Yeah, so one of the other exciting things which has come out of this recent network meeting is that we at the Gift Trust will actually be the key partner for Give to Asia to introduce and to look at the Pacific Islands as part of the network. So we're very mindful of the fact that we are a New Zealand-based entity, a Pākehā-led New Zealand-based entity. And so we don't want to represent the Pacific Islands in any way, but we actually have a lot of close connections to the Pacific Islands, and New Zealand is the kind of obvious place for that organisation to be based. So we're going to represent Give to Asia in any philanthropic dealings in the Pacific Islands, and we will be the body that will do due diligence there. And one of the key things that has come out of these network meetings is also that one of the first things we'd like to do is create some sort of a pooled fund, because we almost need to launch this group with something, a tangible thing that donors can buy into and say, okay, this is a cross-border group in the region. What is a theme across that affects all of the countries in this region, and that people might want to pool their funds and fund a really interesting program of work. And one of the things that we put forward was that theme should be around the climate. A lot to do with, obviously, the Pacific Islands, but also if you look across Asia as well, so many of the countries across Asia and the Pacific are going to be more impacted because of climate change, because they're low-lying, they're closer to the sea, and also having populations of people who are living closer to the poverty line just means they're going to be impacted more by these things. So that's a really obvious theme, and that will be what our first pooled fund will be around. We're still trying to work out exactly the nuances of what it will be, but essentially each partner in each country will look for interesting work that's happening in their home country and bring it to the group, and then we will basically develop a pooled network of interesting projects that are kind of cutting edge, working on this theme, and then donors can pool their funds and feel like they're funding something which has real regional impact across the whole of the Asia-Pacific region. So we're quite excited about that. We like the idea of it will probably end up being around climate justice and climate equity, so making sure that those marginalised people are not as impacted by it as they probably are going to be. So that will be one of the themes, and we'll be looking for interesting programs that we can add into it.
Yeah, I'm really excited for Aotearoa New Zealand to step up in this realm, coming from a perspective of how much the United States has to contend with difficult politicized immigration issues of people coming across the borders, and how challenging it is for politicians to craft immigration policy that's really satisfactory to all of the needs of the public and the constituents and the voters. And New Zealand, we've had this really interesting privilege of being this isolated set of islands where you can't really get here unless you have the appropriate visa and documentation, because you'd have to take a flight. And so we haven't contended with that, but it does create, a little bit of our own privileged bubble. And yet, here are neighbors just, on these tiny, small islands where you're talking about subsistence farming, you're talking about storm surges, you're talking about rising sea levels, you're talking about living close to the poverty line. And, it's not like they created the emissions problems of the developed world that are currently resulting in these dramatic climate effects. And where are they going to go? What are they going to do? How are they going to find livelihoods? I mean, their homes are being destroyed, right? And so, this is an easy thing for New Zealand, relatively speaking, to say, hey, these are our neighbors and these are brethren, let's take care of one another. And so the philanthropic sector can really lead in some of that thinking and some of that early adoption and prototyping and saying, okay, like let's take responsibility and step up here. And so I hope this Give to Asia partnership might be a way to also play in that space, because as a population in New Zealand, we don't really talk about climate refugees. We don't really talk about managed retreat and settlement. And these things are potentially coming much faster than we're really equipped to deal with.
Totally. I think the recent cyclone and weather events that we had here in the north of New Zealand has made those conversations a little bit higher. People are starting to talk about managed retreat. But yeah, I totally agree. Bringing the small Pacific Island nations into that conversation is so important. And the bit that I'm quite excited about actually is a lot of those Pacific Island nations, they have close ties with New Zealand. They don't have close ties, generally speaking. Some do, but to other countries across Asia. And what this network has made us realise is there are a huge amount, the amount of essentially millionaires that are growing in some of these Asian countries, particularly in Singapore, Hong Kong and other countries, who are interested in being philanthropic, but haven't really got that cultural history of, like, they might have a history of putting funds back into their own countries, but don't really know outside of that where to put money to. Giving small localized projects access to that kind of philanthropic funding will be really exciting, and I think might build some interesting links. New Zealand obviously is a really important player in this because we have a lot of Asian migration here, and so we have a lot of people from all sorts of Asian countries moving here, some of whom are wealthy and philanthropic, but also have ties back home in their countries to others who would be as well. So being that bridge kind of between, the Pacific nations, which don't have the link, the Asian countries, which might want to put some funding in, is a really interesting place to be, I think. Nice. And this network will hopefully help us to do that.
Nice. Well, very exciting. Looking forward to watching that progress. Are there any other questions I didn't ask or messages that you want to share, reflections on philanthropic space or the Gift Trust that you'd like to end with?
Oh, that's tricky. I don't think so. It's been a lovely conversation and just really interesting to see all the linkages, isn't it, between, it's not about the Gift Trust, but it's about those linkages in the environment space and philanthropy. And actually, I think what you're doing with this podcast series is really interesting because you're opening the conversation up to talk to innovative people in the funding space, but also actually working on the ground in these regenerative programs. And it's about kind of the power imbalance that can sometimes exist too. So I think for all of us, it's kind of a learning curve of how we can sit on either side of those issues and think about the funding that comes to those projects, but just ultimately the change that we want to see in the world is why we're all in this. So that's the exciting bit for me.
Great. I really appreciate your work in the space, Cheryl. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Cheryl is just an absolute rock star. She's clearly and diligently putting together infrastructure and all of the pieces that really is going to serve so many different groups and communities and have profound ripple effects into the future. And it's exciting to hear about this partnership with Give to Asia. I think there's real promise there, especially as New Zealand reckons with how to respond to the climate displacement and to support our brothers and sisters in the Pacific Islands. To learn more, get involved, and open your giving account today, go to thegifttrust.org.nz. There's a link in the show notes. And of course, like, share, subscribe, get involved. You can find this conversation and many more at maearth.com. I look forward to seeing you on the next one.